All right,
All right, good to
so
go.
my name is Ethan Batino, and I'll be presenting the influence of invasive plants on the biodiversity and biomass of ants. So the first thing I really want to talk about is how throughout ecosystems, species interact and benefit from each other. In particular, the interactions between insects and plants are often mutualistic. And these relationships, the insects will typically offer the plant a service in return for food or shelter. A common example of a mutualistic insect-plant interaction is seed dispersal, in which the seed will disperse the seed of a plant in return for food. So if you look in the bottom left, there's a picture of a dung beetle, and essentially what's going on there is there's seeds in the dung, and the dung beetle rolls it around, essentially dispersing the seed for the plant, while it in return eats the dung for food. Another example, a classic example of an insect-plant interaction is pollination. So the second image on the right shows pollination, and in this relationship, insect pollinators will disperse the plant's pollen and receive a rather consistent reward of nectar or pollen from the plant. And these types of interactions are really vital for modern ecosystem resilience because they increase the biodiversity of both the insect and the plant. Because they're both being supported throughout this interaction. So next thing I want to talk about is how, unfortunately, human influence often disrupts the relationships between plants and insects. A pertinent anthropogenic influence is landscape alteration. So whether this be through forest fires, deforestation, or simply pesticide use, humans alter landscapes drastically in a plethora of different ways. However, the influence of human management techniques on the relationship between insects and plants is not really that known. The primary anthropogenic influence my research focuses on is the introduction of invasive plant species to ecosystems. So invasive plants compete with native plants for limited space, limited resources, and even insect services, which ultimately threatens the biodiversity of native plants along with their relationship with insects. So think about it like this. If the presence of invasive plants threatens the biodiversity of native plants, it also threatens the relationship that the native plants have with insects, and subsequently it threatens the biodiversity and biomass of the affected insects. So now it's time to talk about ants. Ants are ubiquitous insects, collectively constituting more biomass than all of the world's wild birds and wild mammals combined. While being ubiquitous, ants also have a plethora of interactions with plants, making them the perfect species to represent insects while evaluating the influence of invasive species and human management techniques on insects. So, through relationships, ants provide plants with services in return for food and or shelter. For example, ants do seed dispersal. So if you look in the center image there, the middle image, you see ants dispersing a seed, and there's like on the top of the seed, there's like a fleshy attachment, which is called an elizome. And that essentially serves as a protein source for the ants. So what the ants will end up doing is they'll take the seed into their nest and eat the elizome, which provides the ants with a protein source, but also it essentially plants the seed for the plant. Interactions like this are really vital for the biodiversity of the ants and the myrmecophytes. And myrmecophytes is just a way to say like plants that have interactions with ants. And so yeah, the interactions like that are really vital for the biodiversity of ants and myrmecophytes because the ants are integral to the reproduction strategy of the myrmecophytes, while the plants are a strong, viable food source for the ants. So yeah, they both get benefit. So my main objective, was to evaluate the influence of the introduction of invasive plants and human management practices on the biodiversity and biomass of ants. While there have not been many studies on the influence of while there have been many studies on the influence of invasive ants on native plants, I could not find any studies that focused on the influence of invasive plants on ants. I hypothesized that the invasive plants disrupt the relationship between ants and native plants. So in order to prove that, we got to do an experiment. In our experiment, we collected ants and also inevitably other insects at 4 sites using pitfall traps. What pitfall traps are they're small plastic cups that I filled with 35 milliliters of propylene glycol, which essentially served as a way to preserve the specimens that fell into the cup throughout the experiment. As for the research sites, there were 4 of them located in suburban Illinois. So out of the 4 sites, 1 was quantified as native and managed, 1 was native and unmanaged, 1 was invasive and managed, and 1 was invasive and unmanaged. I used the plant common buckthorn as a staple, which is a staple invasive plant, as an indication for invasion. So essentially what that means is if buckthorn was identified at a site, it would be considered invasive because the buckthorn indicated invasion. If no buckthorn was identified at a site, it would just be considered a native research site. The status of managed or unmanaged of a research site was determined by calling the research sites and inquiring about their management techniques. So if they said they did any mowing, any watering, or using any pesticides, that would essentially qualify them as a managed site. We ended up installing 20 pitfall traps at each site, leaving them to collect data for 48 hours. After we collected the pitfall traps, the specimens were all dried and weighed. In terms of the way the pitfall traps were laid out, it was an 8-foot by 6-foot grid. They were all evenly spread out. And yeah, okay. So I'm gonna start talking about data and results now. I'm covering the graph so I can specifically draw your attention to the axis of this graph. So if you look on the y-axis of this graph, it's biomass in grams. And then the x-axis relates to the site and each site and their respective results. So I'm gonna uncover the data now. You can see that the native and unmanaged site had more ant and ground-dwelling insect biomass than the invasive and unmanaged site. And we see a similar trend again with the managed site. So the native and managed site had more ant and ground-dwelling insect biomass than the invasive and managed site. So general trend we see here, just to sum it all up, is the native sites had more biomass than the invasive sites. So then I'm gonna do the same thing again here with this next graph. On the y-axis, we have species richness, which is just a count of the amount of species. So when I collect ants and I see 4 different ant species, it's a species richness of 4. It's just really simple. On the x-axis, it is the site and its respective data. So here, you look at the native and unmanaged site, and it had more species richness of ant and ground-dwelling insects than the invasive and unmanaged site. And again, we see a similar trend with the managed sites, where the native and managed site had more insect species richness than the invasive and managed site. It is important to note, it's sort of like an oddity or whatever. It's in the species richness where the ant native and managed and ant invasive and managed species richness was the same, but ultimately this was a pilot study and we have limited data. So in the future, I would like to get more data to test out if this was an oddity or not, which I believe it to be because it doesn't match with the rest of our data. Okay, so conclusions. Ant species richness was great, and ant species biomass was greater at native sites than invasive sites. And same thing with the ground-dwelling insect species richness and ground-dwelling insect species biomass. It was greater at native sites than invasive sites. And this sort of could connect to the fact that the invasive plants really got rid of a lot of the interactions that these insect species would be having with plants that would have benefited them, but now they don't get any of that benefit. So yeah, thank you for coming to my presentation. Any questions?
Thank you, Ethan. I do have a couple questions here. 2 specifically. So how do you think that buckthorn specifically impacted the native ant populations? So you presented that really interesting case of the seed and the ants, and I mean, the relationship seemed clear.
Right.
I'm curious, what do you think buckthorn had to do with these native ant populations?
I understand. So essentially, it's not exactly a specific buckthorn did this, but in like generally with invasive plants in nature, they compete with the native plants for resources. So think about it like this. Let's say we have a certain amount of native plants in an ecosystem that are all interacting with ants, right? And then when invasive plants come in, they will lower the biodiversity of the native plants. So what that does is if there's a lower amount of native plants, that means that there are less plants that can interact with the ants and give them some sort of benefit. So to sum it all up, invasive plants compete with native plants, and that makes it so there's less native plants to give stuff to ants.
Makes a lot of sense. And then the last question, were you surprised that the managed sites in general had more ant biomass, particularly for the native sites? And why do you think that is the case?
Yes, so I was really surprised at first, because I didn't like formally hypothesize this, but I did like believe that the sites that were not touched by humans would harbor greater biomass and species richness. There's a lot of studies that sort of talk about the influence of like human management on, or disturbance in general is what it's called, on biodiversity. But something I will say is things like the intermediate species intermediate disturbance hypothesis kind of state that like an intermediate amount of disturbance maximizes biodiversity, which might be what happened in this research experiment, but that would require a lot more data.
Very cool. Love it. Those are the questions I have. Thank you very much, Ethan, for your presentation. It's fascinating. I never knew there were so many ants in the world. Happy to know the
Yeah.
answer right now.